Research shows that feeding tubes do little, if anything, to improve quality of life for many dying patients. But as disease progresses, particularly in patients with advanced dementia, swallowing becomes more difficult. It seemed an obvious solution has been to provide nutrition by feeding tube. But as we hear from Brown University researcher Dr. Joan Tino, a closer look at feeding tubes placed in patients with advanced dementia produced interesting, if not alarming, results.
First of all, we found about 1 in 10 family members stated that no one asked them about whether a feeding tube should be inserted. And that just sort of is contrary to all the tenets of informed consent. About, again, 1 in 10 family members who did talk with a doctor said that the doctor was somewhat coercive in pushing the family into inserting a feeding tube. And there was important problems with the process. Anytime you do informed consent, you want to know about the risk and the benefit of that procedure. Now, while feeding tube doesn't have a high mortality rate associated with it, there's some very important risk. And only 1/3 of the family members reported that they were informed of the risk of a feeding tube. The other thing it's important to know is our new research really suggests that feeding tubes can cause harm to patients.
In your view, what kinds of cases benefit from ANH and what kind do not?
Do not is easier. In dementia patients, there's no evidence that no published paper that has ever suggested it prevents pneumonia or improves quality of life. And the overwhelming evidence is, and this is important, is it doesn't prolong life either. In most patients with Alzheimer's disease, they live just as long. In gut problems and in a few throat problems, putting in a feeding tube is beneficial.
JoAnne, do families realize this?
Families don't realize any of this. And as I was listening to Dr. Tino and listening to this conversation, I mean, it just strikes me that the onus is on us to really present all of this clearly. And remember that this is happening for the first time to this family. We've seen this many, many times. Expecting a family even to make a decision after they've heard one brief conversation about what we might perceive to be the benefits around a tube feeding just doesn't make sense. It takes more time than that to really understand and think through. And Tom is right. There's pressure to move people from one setting to another and not always take the time to have the full conversations.
So Terry, talk about informed consent here.
Informed consent, oh my gosh, informed consent is very complex. But the bottom line is that even with the evidence that we are accumulating, continue to accumulate, which is our responsibility, as you said, to share with patients and to share with family. The evidence for families is very much one part of that. So they absolutely have to have that if they're going to consent. And that informed consent projects into the future. This is what we expect to happen. This is the upside or the downside. Even with all that, it's really important when we talk about quality of life because we're hospice and palliative care folks, and it extends beyond the patient. It extends to the family and the family system, and whether or not the extension of life is a person lying in bed who is comfort fed because our institutions support the staffing for that, they're financially able to provide that, or is this somebody who lies day after day after day with no input and the family suffers enormously about that because of culture, religious, past values, or whatever the meaning of it is. So it's about the patient and all the data that we're getting, but it also is about the extended network because we are committed to treating the patient as well as the family, right?
Well,
as
Frank,
the
could
unit
I
of
just
care.
say,
Sure, please.
You were asking which patients are benefited, but Terry's pointing out that there's another very important ethical problem here. A lot of times we're providing burdensome treatment to a patient for the benefit of somebody else. It's the people who love them, but it's somebody else, and we're not sticking to the idea that the patient is our main goal here.
Well, that brings me right to the question that I wanted to ask you, JoAnne, and that is, do families even realize that there could be a downside to this kind of care, to ANH?
They might perceive that there's a downside, but unless that's clearly laid out for them, they wouldn't be able to understand that. I think that they don't appreciate the burdens and that they are, as we all do, we're always hoping and believing that there's more time and that feeding people, as it has always been their experience in life, when you're sick and you need nutrition, if you feed, people will get better. if they're not presented with the burdens that, as Tom is pointing out, in many cases, in people with advanced dementia or people who are very close to the end of life, those burdens that we talked about really outweigh. There's no benefit, but there's significant burden, and they don't understand that balance.
Now that
I would say the most coercive false statement could be, and it's commonly used, is we could put a feeding tube in your dad, or we could let him starve to death. And that is, at any point in the conversation, everything you've said before, you're back at the beginning again, because that is a complete misrepresentation of the facts. There are plenty of harms from
That's
it.
so true, and families never forget that.
And
when you
families
say
never
that.
forget that. We're starving our
Sometimes they
dad
bring
to
it to
death.
us.
How could that
They
be?
bring
a doctor would say that?
Not so often a doctor, but someone with a very specific ideas about morality.
So it could be within the family. It could be somebody they happen on.
It could be a next door neighbor. It can, if that particular sentence can
And
come.
what do you say specifically to somebody who says, somebody just told me I could starve my dad to death here? I can't let that happen. Let the disease take its course.
What I would say is he's not doing well with our efforts to feed him by hand. We could try a peg tube, but the overwhelming evidence is that he'll die pretty soon if he gets the peg, and there's no evidence really that he'll live longer if we put it in.